Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
All of this happened too many years ago, and it happened to me and my father, although I only truly understood what had happened much later, because at the time I was young, and things back then were very different from what they are now. It was only years later that my father finally told me the truth about that night. We lived in the Appalachian Mountains, in an area that nowadays gets a fair amount of tourism because it sits near one of the entrances to one of the more well-known hiking trails. But back then, tourism had barely started, and the Appalachians were still deeply isolated. I am not saying they are not isolated today, because there are still places out here where people live incredibly cut-off lives. But the area where I grew up changed a lot over the years. Tourists arrived, roads improved, more people started passing through. I would not even say that change was entirely good or entirely bad. Like most things, it came with both sides of the coin. On one hand, supplies reached us faster, there was more diversity, more people from different places, and I think there is something healthy about that. On the other hand, tourism, when people do not respect the land, destroys habitats, damages the forest. And over the years, we started seeing more trash left behind on trails. A lot of people simply do not respect the woods. Park rangers spend half their time cleaning up messes that should never exist in the first place. Anyway, my point is simply that the place where this happened no longer feels like the same world. Because back then, our town was completely isolated, and even the forest itself was a place most people avoided. There were countless stories circulating when I was growing up, especially stories passed down from my grandparents' generation. Stories about people who lived deep in the woods. And I am not talking about the kind of people mention nowadays. Drug operations or criminals hiding out in remote areas. Those exist too, sure. But that is not what I mean. I mean people who had separated themselves from society entirely. People who lived by their own rules, with habits and customs that seemed strange to everyone else. The truth is, most of us knew some of these people existed. And for the most part, there was an unspoken agreement. We left them alone, and they left us alone. In fact, my father and I had once even been helped by one of them before. So, I do not want this story to sound like some kind of attack against people who choose to live outside society. That is not what this is. We genuinely believed that whatever was happening out there had nothing to do with those people. We believed there was some kind of cult operating in those mountains at the time. So, getting directly into the story, now that the context makes more sense, I was 9 years old when this happened. My father, my grandfather, even my mother and grandmother were all people who depended heavily on the forest. A huge amount of what we ate came from the woods. Plants, herbs, mushrooms, roots, things most people nowadays would walk right past without recognizing. My grandparents especially knew the forest in ways that honestly felt almost impossible. They knew which herbs could kill you within minutes and which ones could heal you. They knew how to cook things safely, how to preserve them, how to recognize danger just from smell or color. Because of that, my father and I spent a lot of time gathering mushrooms together, and it was during one of those trips that my father suddenly suggested that we head back home, drop off the mushrooms, and come back 2 days later to spend a couple nights camping in the mountains. It was going to be my first time camping with him. My parents had done it many times before while I was younger, but I had always stayed behind with my grandparents. I had never gone with them, so to me it felt almost like a rite of passage. It felt like my father had finally decided I was old enough to handle it, old enough to be trusted out there with him, old enough to understand the rules of the forest. I remember being incredibly excited. And I also remember my father immediately shutting that excitement down before it could fully show on my face. He told me the forest was not a place for excitement. It was not a place for showing off or pretending to be brave. He reminded me that in the woods, instinct mattered more than pride. If he told me to do something, I had to do it immediately. No hesitation, no questions. I understood what he meant, even if I was still thrilled inside. The forest was full of dangers, and unlike outsiders, people who grew up there understood that a lot of the old stories existed for a reason. When we got home and handed the mushrooms over to my mother, we told her we would be leaving for the mountains the next morning. I could immediately tell she was uneasy about it. She tried not to show it too much, but I saw the worry on her face. Still, my mother was never the kind of person who stopped me from growing. She believed people had to experience things for themselves, and if I got hurt, then I could always come back home afterward. She only interfered when she truly believed there was immediate danger. Since I was going with my father, and she trusted him completely, all she really did was give us that look that silently begged us to be careful before letting us go. We started our trip early the following morning. Like I said, I was unbelievably excited because we were finally entering a section of the forest I had never been allowed into before. That area had always been completely off limits to me unless I was with my parents. It was not like I had never been in the woods before. I had gone mushroom hunting with friends plenty of times, but never alone and never anywhere near that part of the mountains. The moment we crossed into that section of forest, I immediately felt something shift. The air itself felt different. The woods were darker there. The trees were thicker, taller, closer together. The sounds of the forest seemed louder somehow, layered on top of each other until it almost sounded alive. It genuinely felt like we had stepped into the heart of the mountains themselves. I was completely mesmerized by it all. I was a child seeing an entirely new world for the first time. And despite my father's warnings, I could barely contain how amazed I was. But around 3 hours later, things started changing. We had been moving slowly because I was still small, and my father constantly had to slow his pace so I could keep up. So realistically, it would probably have only taken an adult about half that time to cover the same distance. I remember noticing my father becoming tense. At first it was subtle. His shoulders tightened slightly, and he started stopping more often to listen. Then I realized the sounds around us were changing too. Certain noises in the forest seemed unnaturally loud, while others had almost completely disappeared. My father quietly told me he thought there might be an animal nearby, and because of that, I needed to stay close to him, stay calm, and not panic no matter what happened. Then he asked me if I smelled something strange, and I did. It was a rotten smell, thick, wet, almost sweet in the worst possible way. A smell so heavy it seemed to stick to the back of my throat. That was when I realized the sound I had been hearing was not just insects in general. It was flies, thousands of them. The buzzing was so loud it sounded almost mechanical, like standing beside an overflowing dumpster during the middle of summer. My father told me to stay where I was while he moved ahead between two large trees where I could no longer fully see him. I knew where he was standing, but only barely. Through the gaps between the trunks, I could only make out the back of his head and part of his shoulders. Then I saw him look down at something on the ground. He immediately raised a hand over his mouth, as if trying to stop himself from reacting out loud. And in that exact moment, I watched his entire body posture change. I remember calling out to him, asking what was going on, and the way he answered me actually scared me a little at the time. His voice came out sharp, almost aggressive. Although looking back now, considering the situation, I completely understand why. He told me to stay exactly where I was, then immediately walked back over to me. He explained that he had found a dead animal and that it might be part of some hunting area. And because of that, he was worried a hunter could accidentally mistake us for targets if we stayed there too long. So, he told me we needed to move away from that part of the forest immediately, and that we might even have to turn back entirely. At the time, I got upset in the way children do when they do not understand what is happening. I started complaining, whining about the trip ending before it had even really started. Obviously, now I know my father had been lying to protect me. What he had actually found was not an animal at all. It was a person. Years later, when my father finally explained everything to me, he told me the state of the body had been horrifying beyond words. It was immediately obvious that someone had done that intentionally. Parts of the skin were missing entirely, removed with enough precision that my father became physically sick the moment he saw it. I still remember him telling me years later that the thing that disturbed him the most was not even the violence itself, but the realization that somebody had deliberately taken pieces of skin from the body as if they were collecting material for something. But back then I knew none of this. I was just a child complaining because I thought my father was overreacting, until eventually he had to firmly remind me that he was in charge, and that if he said we were leaving, then we were leaving. So we turned around and started walking back the way we had come. We had not even been moving for 2 full minutes before we saw her. She was sitting in the distance between the trees, perfectly still at first, almost blending into the woods themselves. Even now, I can remember her clearly. She was wearing a dress that looked ancient, stained and worn down as if it had been used for years without ever being properly cleaned. Her hair was incredibly long, hanging almost all the way down to the forest floor, and although it looked recently washed, there was something uncared for about it, something wild. She was hunched over whatever was in front of her, her back bent at an unnatural angle, while she focused entirely on something she was doing on the ground. My father stopped instantly. A second later, the woman noticed us standing there and slowly turned toward us. That was when we saw her hands. They were completely red. At first, to my 9-year-old mind, it almost looked like paint. But even then, some part of me understood it was blood. Her fingers moved carefully and repeatedly in small, precise motions, and it genuinely looked as though she was sewing something together. At the time, I could not process what I was seeing, but my father understood immediately. The moment he saw the stitching motion and the blood covering her hands, he connected it to the body he had just found and realized what she was using as material. I remember my father's reaction perfectly because he was never an aggressive man, never somebody who threatened people. But I watched him point directly at her while speaking in a voice I had never heard from him before. He warned her not to come any closer. He told her to stay exactly where she was. He said we had ways to protect ourselves, that we were not going to tell anyone anything, that we were simply leaving and going back the way we came. I had absolutely no idea what was happening. I had not understood what she was sewing. I had only seen her blood-covered hands and the look on my father's face. But he was my father, and I trusted him completely, so we turned around immediately and started moving as fast as I could manage through the trees. When we finally reached a slightly more open section of forest, my father told me to run, so I ran. After a while, I physically could not keep up anymore, and without saying anything, he grabbed me, threw me onto his back, and started carrying me while running himself. I still remember the sound of his breathing, completely out of breath, panicked, pushing himself harder than I had ever seen before. Even though I still did not fully understand the danger we were in, his reaction alone was enough to terrify me. Children know when adults are genuinely afraid, and my father was terrified. Because of that, I stayed completely silent for the rest of the journey. Eventually, we reached the section of forest I already recognized, the safer part near the areas where people actually traveled. My father finally put me back down and told me we needed to keep walking as fast as possible until we reached the town again. Once we got home, he left me with my mother and said he needed to speak with the police. I kept asking him what was happening, and every single time he told me not to worry, that everything was fine, that he just needed to confirm something with the sheriff. But of course, everything was not fine. He reported everything he had seen in the woods, and years later, he finally told me the truth about what had happened. The woman had genuinely been sewing with human skin. Apparently, a massive investigation followed, or at least as massive as something like that could have been in such an isolated area over 40 years ago. People have to understand what life was like out there back then. We barely had resources. The local sheriff's department was tiny and completely unequipped for something that serious. My father told me some federal people eventually arrived, though he never fully understood who they were. He was not the kind of man who cared much about government agencies, so he simply accepted whoever showed up without asking questions. As far as I know, the case was never solved. Nobody ever identified the person my father found in the forest because the body itself was never recovered. It disappeared before authorities could return to the exact location. There had always been disappearances in that region, and honestly, there still are, although not nearly as many now that the area has become more populated with hikers, tourists, and park rangers. Back then, people disappeared all the time. That was just something people quietly learned to live with. Sometimes families did not even report it because they assumed the person had simply gotten tired of their old life and left on purpose. So the story faded over time without ever truly being resolved. My father passed away around 6 years ago now, and even today, this story still chills me in a way I cannot properly explain. The idea that there were people operating in those forests with habits so grotesque and inhuman still sits in the back of my mind every time I hike through those mountains. I still live in the same region, and I still spend a lot of time in the woods, but every single time I pass through that area, which today looks completely harmless with its maintained trail and scenic viewpoints, I cannot stop thinking about what happened there 40 years ago. Most people walking that trail today have absolutely no idea what used to exist in those mountains. I've always been a bit contradictory when it comes to how I live. Ever since I was a kid, I've had this constant push and pull between two kinds of anxiety that don't really cancel each other out. On one side, I've always felt uncomfortable in places with too many people, cities especially, where everything feels too close, too loud, too immediate. On the other side, complete isolation has never exactly felt natural either. So, I ended up building my life somewhere in between those two extremes, trying to avoid both of them as much as possible. If I had to be honest, the fear of social environments was always the stronger one. That's probably why, when I finally moved out of my parents' house in West Virginia, I didn't hesitate for long between my options. One place was closer to town, surrounded by people I already knew, including a few who I had grown up with and who never really treated me well. I didn't want to be anywhere near that. The other option was further out, much more isolated, surrounded by forest and distance, where the only real sound most days was wind and whatever animals passed through. I chose the second one. At first it wasn't comfortable. I won't pretend it was. Living alone in a place like that changes the way you experience silence. It becomes something physical, almost like pressure. But over time, something shifted. The lack of constant interaction stopped feeling like emptiness and started feeling like control. No unexpected conversations, no obligations, no presence I didn't choose. My work also helped with that. I work online, I set my own deadlines, I don't answer to coworkers or fixed schedules, so my days are entirely mine. I don't really follow a typical structure, and I don't interact with many people at all. The only real constant in my life is one of my closest friends from childhood. He understands the way I am, never pushed me to be different, and honestly, he's similar in a lot of ways. Apart from that, my parents are still around, but contact is limited and simple. That's pretty much it. I don't really keep up with much outside of what I choose to watch online. Most of the time, it's just YouTube videos or random updates about things happening in the world, but even that feels distant, and strangely enough, that's the version of life I've always been most comfortable with. That's why what I'm about to describe caught me completely off guard. It was around 4 in the morning. I was in the kitchen, preparing a small snack before going to bed, something I've done countless times without thinking about it. While I was there, I had this brief feeling, almost like a shift in air inside the house. The kind of sensation that makes you instinctively check doors and windows even if nothing obvious is wrong. So, I did a quick walk through the house. Everything looked fine, locked and closed, exactly how it always is before I go to sleep. Nothing stood out, nothing seemed off. I remember thinking it was probably just my imagination, maybe fatigue, and I went back upstairs. I sat down in bed with my snack and picked up a book. I barely got through 10 pages. Not even that, maybe less. I remember looking at the clock at some point and thinking it was around 4:15, maybe a little later. After that, everything feels like it collapses into a very short gap of time. I didn't even feel myself fall asleep properly. I just remember waking up, but it wasn't gradual. There was no confusion, no slow return to awareness. It was immediate, sharp, like something had pulled me out of sleep. My body reacted before my mind, and the first thing I noticed was sound of footsteps. Not outside the house, but inside, coming down the hallway. Slow at first, then clearer, as if whoever it was had stopped trying to be quiet. And then I heard my bedroom door. The handle moved. Just once at first, a slight test, like someone checking if it would open. That was the moment my body reacted without permission. I rolled instinctively, completely disoriented, lost my balance, and ended up on the floor beside my bed without even understanding how I got there. The instinct wasn't to look or confirm anything. It was purely survival. I stayed low, pressed against the floor, facing the doorway from underneath the bed frame. From that angle, I could still see part of the room and the door. I remember waiting for it to open. That part is hard to explain properly, because in moments like that, time doesn't feel continuous. It stretches, breaks, and slows down in a way that makes every second feel separate from the next. I was convinced the door was going to swing open at any moment, but it didn't. The footsteps changed direction instead. They started moving away from the door. And then nothing. There was silence again. I stayed where I was for a long time. Long enough that my body started shaking from the aftermath rather than the fear itself. I don't know exactly how long it was, but at some point I became aware that I was still waiting for something that wasn't coming. Eventually, I forced myself out from under the bed. I turned on every light in the house, one by one, and checked every room. Nothing looked disturbed, and nothing was missing. Nothing had changed except the attic door. It was open. I don't know how to explain that part properly. I don't remember it being open before going to bed, and I certainly don't use it often. In fact, I hadn't touched it in a long time. But it was open enough that I couldn't ignore it. I checked it carefully, but there was nothing inside that suggested what had just happened. I replaced the lock the next day without hesitation. I went into town for it, even though I normally avoid doing that unless absolutely necessary. I hate going into town. Too many people, too much noise, too much everything. But I didn't want to risk ignoring it. For a few days after that, I barely slept properly. Every small sound in the house felt huge. I kept expecting it to happen again, even though logically there was no reason for it to. About a week later, I was walking near my property, but more on the forest side when I heard movement nearby. When I turned, I saw a man standing there. He looked wrong is probably the simplest way to put it. Unkempt, disoriented, like someone who hadn't been taking care of himself for a long time. When he spoke, he was smiling. He said something along the lines of, almost casually, like he was commenting on the weather, that he had scared me pretty well the other night. I didn't stay there. I told him to back away immediately. My voice came out sharper than I expected, and I remember telling him that if he tried anything again, he wouldn't be lucky twice. Then I left. I got back to my car and drove straight to the police station. I filed a report. I didn't try to interpret anything at that point. I just described what had happened as clearly as I could. A couple of days later, I found out he had been caught doing something similar at another property nearby. This time, the homeowner managed to detain him until the police arrived. He's in custody now, as far as I know, but something in me didn't fully settle with it. Even though I know there's a rational explanation, even though I know the situation was resolved, my sense of isolation never quite returned to what it was before. It's still there, just not as quiet as it used to be. I have a job that most people would probably describe as morbid, although to me it has always felt more like a quiet extension of something human rather than anything strange or dark. I learned it from my girlfriend about 10 years ago, and now, in a slightly different form, we both still do it. She leans more toward vintage clothing, things that carry history in fabric and texture, while I tend to deal more with objects in general, the kind of things people leave behind when a life ends and nobody quite knows what to do with the weight of it all. What we do, in simple terms, is handle estates after someone passes away. Sometimes we are contacted directly by families, sometimes we reach out ourselves after going through obituaries. But the core idea is always the same. We help clear out homes in a way that tries to be as gentle as possible. Not everything is about value or resale. First and foremost, we go through everything carefully. Return whatever the family wants to keep. Make sure personal items are treated with respect. And only after that do we deal with what remains. Furniture, clothing, household objects, things that no one in the family wants or is able to take with them, those are what we eventually recover and resell. I know some people find that uncomfortable, and I understand why they might, but we've always tried to approach it in a way that feels more like preservation than disposal, like giving objects a second life instead of letting them disappear without acknowledgement. This particular job started like most others, at least on paper. A family had contacted us about their grandmother who had passed away roughly 2 months earlier. The funeral had already been arranged, everything formal had been handled, but the house itself was still untouched. It was located in a fairly isolated part of the Appalachian region, far enough out that the family themselves couldn't easily travel there, and they specifically asked us to retrieve certain personal items, mainly photographs and letters that had sentimental value. The rest of the contents of the house were ours to go through, and anything we deemed usable or valuable we could keep and resell. Work like that usually carries a certain expectation with it. Older homes in remote areas tend to hold objects that have been passed down for generations, sometimes unexpectedly valuable, sometimes just deeply personal. So, I'll admit, I was genuinely looking forward to it in that quiet, practical way that comes with experience. Not excitement exactly, but anticipation. The kind of mindset where you expect to find stories embedded in objects. The arrangement was straightforward. I would go there first, spend a few days going through the house and organizing everything, and my girlfriend, who is now my wife, would join me later to focus specifically on the clothing and textiles. That part of the process is usually more delicate, more emotional in a way. So, she tends to handle it with more care than I do. In this case, I was the one who went ahead alone, since everything had already been coordinated with the family, and payment had been made in advance for the retrieval of specific items. What I didn't expect, and what I still struggle to explain clearly even now, is how quickly that sense of routine broke down once I arrived. The house was even more isolated than I had anticipated. The moment I entered the area, I realized there was no reception at all, which wasn't entirely unusual for that region, but still enough to make things feel slightly disconnected. I had the address though, and even without GPS, I'm fairly comfortable navigating with maps and landmarks, so I continued until I was certain I was in the right place. The structure matched the description, and everything about it seemed consistent with what I had been told. But when I pulled up, there was someone already there. An elderly woman sitting on the porch. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had made a mistake. It wouldn't have been the first time an address led to confusion in rural areas where properties aren't clearly marked. So I double-checked mentally, then stepped out of the car and approached carefully. I asked her if I had the right place, if she was related to the family I had spoken with, or if I had somehow ended up at the wrong property entirely. She didn't answer immediately. She just looked at me for a long time. Not hostile and not welcoming either, just measured, like she was trying to decide how to interpret my presence. I gave her the space to respond, assuming she might simply be hard of hearing or slow to process the question. Eventually, she told me I hadn't made a mistake. This was the right house. And then she said something that didn't fit into anything I had been told or believed. She said she was the owner, that she wasn't dead, and that her family had always had a habit of telling people she was, essentially clearing out parts of her life under that assumption. The way she said it wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic either. It was tired, almost resigned, like the statement had been repeated in her mind too many times to carry shock anymore. But hearing it in that context, standing there at the edge of the porch, immediately shifted something in me. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was pure discomfort. I explained why I was there, carefully, trying not to assume anything. I told her about the family's request, the photographs, the letters, the agreement we had been given. Her response surprised me even more than her first statement. She didn't object. She didn't deny the arrangement. Instead, she simply said there was no problem, that if I needed to take things, I could take whatever I wanted, and that it didn't really matter anymore whether she was officially considered alive or not. That moment is hard to describe properly because it didn't feel like consent in the normal sense. It felt like detachment, like she had already separated herself from the idea that the house belonged to her in any meaningful way. I remember standing there longer than I should have, unsure of how to proceed. There was a strong sense of unease, not because anything overtly threatening had happened, but because the entire situation felt ethically unstable. I even suggested, carefully, that I could cancel the job, return the payment, and inform the family that I wouldn't proceed under these circumstances. She declined, just calmly, as if the outcome didn't matter either way. She told me I could stay, do what I needed to do, and leave when I was finished. There was no resistance, no urgency, nothing that made the situation easier to categorize. And because I had already been paid, and because I was physically there with no immediate way to contact anyone, I stayed. Not comfortably, not confidently, but out of obligation mixed with uncertainty. I know I should have gone back and called the family, but honestly, I didn't know what to do. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before, and I just froze. On top of that, she kept insisting that I come in, as if she really needed me to, like she didn't want to be alone again. I decided I would stay for a little while, assess the situation better, and then I just kept staying, without really knowing why. Over the next few days, I worked through the house slowly. I focused on what the family had specifically requested first, the photographs and letters, carefully sorting them and setting them aside, always asking if it was okay to take those things. I also came across a few additional objects that the woman identified as old and potentially meaningful, and I set those aside as well. Everything else I mostly left untouched. It didn't feel right to approach it as a typical clearance job anymore. The woman herself remained in the house throughout. She rarely spoke. When she did, it was brief, sometimes almost fragmented, like conversation required more effort than she was willing to spend. There were long stretches where she would simply sit in a room without acknowledging anything happening around her, and I found myself trying, unsuccessfully, to interpret whether that was due to age, exhaustion, or something deeper tied to the situation she had described. By the third day, I had started to feel less like I was working in a house, and more like I was moving through someone else's suspended life, trying not to disturb anything that might already be too fragile to touch. And I had started noticing two things I couldn't easily explain away. At first, I tried very hard to rationalize both of them, because the alternative felt uncomfortable in a way I didn't want to sit with. The first was the temperature. Every time she entered a room I was in, the air would shift slightly. Not in a way that could be immediately measured or proven, but enough that I would pause without meaning to. It was like a thin layer of cold settling into the space, subtle at first, then lingering just long enough for me to become aware of it. I told myself it was probably the house itself. Old structures in the Appalachians do that, especially in places where insulation is poor and drafts move through the walls in ways you don't immediately notice. I also told myself it was psychological, that I was already uncomfortable with the situation, and my body was simply reacting to that discomfort by amplifying every small sensation. The second thing was quieter, but harder to ignore once I noticed it. The house creaked constantly under my steps. The floors were old wood, uneven in places, the kind that announce every movement. I had gotten used to it quickly, but she never made a sound, not once. When she moved through the same hallways, when she entered or left a room, there was no creak, no shift in pressure through the floorboards. At first, I thought I was simply missing it, but after a while, it became something I actively paid attention to, and still, nothing ever registered. I know that, being a man and probably weighing 3 times as much as she did, that would make a significant difference. Even so, she should have made some kind of noise, no matter how slight. I found myself getting startled all the time because I would suddenly see her there without ever hearing her come in. She would just appear behind me like a ghost. She also never joined me for meals. I would cook for myself, and then I would prepare a portion for her and bring it to wherever she was sitting. She would accept it without much conversation, sometimes with a small nod, sometimes without any acknowledgement at all. Then she would remain in her own space while I ate alone. I never actually saw her eat. Not properly. There were moments where I would pass by later and the food would be gone, but I never caught her in the act of sitting down to a meal. By the end of the third day, I made the decision to leave. I thanked her for letting me stay, even though the wording felt inadequate for what the experience had been. I apologized for any disruption I might have caused, even though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. Then I packed my things and left the house, driving a considerable distance down the dirt road before I finally got reception again. The moment my phone connected, I called my wife and told her not to come. I didn't have a clear explanation at that point, only that something about the situation felt fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't properly articulate over the phone. Shortly after, I also contacted the family again, specifically the grandson who had originally arranged the work. I told him it had been an uncomfortable experience, that I had stayed longer than intended, and that I wasn't sure the situation inside the house had been as straightforward as they had described. I expected confusion, maybe dismissal, or at least questions. Instead, his response was immediate and direct. He told me she was dead. Not metaphorically, not ambiguously. He said they had proof, and then he sent me the obituary. I remember standing there looking at my phone for a long time without fully processing what I was reading. It wasn't shock in the normal sense. It was something quieter and more disorienting, like my mind refusing to align two versions of the same reality. Because part of me, despite everything, had the clear impression that I had been interacting with someone in that house. And at the same time, another part of me could no longer reconcile that with what I was now seeing on the screen. I drove home in silence. I don't remember much of the journey itself, only the feeling of trying to hold two explanations in my head at once, neither of which fully satisfied what I had experienced. When I arrived, I told my wife everything. We didn't try to immediately assign meaning to it. We just acknowledged how strange it was and left it at that for a while, because anything more concrete felt impossible at the time. For a couple of days afterward, I tried to distance myself from it mentally, but that didn't really work. The house kept coming back into my thoughts in small fragments, not as a single coherent memory, but as isolated details that didn't quite fit together. The cold shifts in rooms, the silence of her movements, the way the space felt occupied, even when nothing visibly confirmed it. Eventually, I decided to reach out again, this time to another member of the family, a granddaughter who responded with more openness than I expected. She spoke about her grandmother with a kind of sadness that didn't feel rehearsed. She told me the family situation had never been simple, that the grandmother had insisted on staying in that house for most of her life, even when it became increasingly difficult for anyone to regularly visit her. There was regret in her words, but not hostility. More like someone trying to make sense of distance after the fact. She assured me she would go to the property herself, that she would look into everything properly, and that whatever had been left unresolved would be addressed with care. The way she said it stayed with me. The whole situation was sad, and I felt heartbroken for that old lady. About 2 months later, I received another message from her. She said she had gone to the house, that she and another relative had spent time there, and that they believed they had managed to give her peace. Whatever that meant in practical terms. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Even now, years later, I still think about that place more often than I would like to admit. I continued doing the same kind of work after that, although not in exactly the same way. Something in me shifted after that experience. I think I can honestly say that, regardless of what happened in that house, I was never the same again. Before I get into what actually happened, I should probably say that I've been meaning to share this for a long time. I've been following this channel for years, almost since it first started, but I never felt confident enough to submit anything because I always worried I wouldn't get the details right, or that I would end up over-explaining the wrong parts and underplaying the ones that actually matter. Over time, I found myself paying attention to how other people tell their stories here, how they pace things, what they choose to include, what they leave out, and I tried to shape my own account around that. I'm not saying this to make anyone think it's fabricated. If anything, it's the opposite. I just know that I might go a bit heavier on certain details from that time than most people would. But in my mind, those details are exactly what makes it real, or at least as close as I can get to describing it properly. So, I've decided to just tell it the way I remember it, without trying to filter too much of it out. With that said, what I'm about to share is one of the most intense and disturbing periods of my life. I'll do my best to explain it as clearly and honestly as I can. My name is Mickey, and although nowadays I am an older man and probably a little more mature when it comes to taking risks, back when I was younger, I was exactly the kind of guy you would expect someone in their early 20s to be. I made impulsive decisions. I rarely thought things through properly, and I walked around with that stupid feeling young men sometimes have, where they believe nothing bad can really happen to them. You probably know the type of person I mean. Most of us have met someone like that at some point, or maybe we were that person ourselves once. Some of you listening might even still be in that phase now, and I do not mean that as criticism. It is normal. What I am trying to explain is that a lot of the things I would immediately recognize today as warning signs barely even registered in my mind back then. Another reason why everything that happened caught me completely off guard was because I was not somebody who grew up in isolated places. I had lived in the city my entire life, and honestly, I still do. The Appalachian Mountains were only a brief chapter of my life, although definitely the most terrifying one. They were never truly my world. I did not grow up hearing local legends, and I certainly did not believe forests could hold things people did not fully understand. To me, stories like that were entertaining at best. Looking back now, I realize how unprepared I really was. And most of that came from my age and from the environment I was used to. In the city, I knew how to recognize danger quickly. You learn to read people, situations, streets, sounds. But the mountains are different, completely different. And unless you have actually spent time out there, it is difficult to explain just how different they really are. This happened in the early 90s. I was 22 years old at the time, and college had never even been a realistic possibility for me. My parents were poor, and I had been working since I was young just to survive. I bounced between different jobs for years until I eventually ended up taking this one, and honestly, I was excited when I got hired. The work mostly involved maintenance and inspection duties in sections of the Appalachian trails. Nowadays, a lot of that work is handled directly by park rangers or people with more formal training, but back then, private companies still handled parts of it because tourism had started increasing and the state needed extra workers. I was one of the few people who managed to get that kind of job while it still existed. Most of my days followed the exact same routine once I arrived in the mountains. Every morning I would head into the forest, spend the day checking trails, replacing damaged signs, inspecting old structures, clearing debris from paths, and then return in the evening. I was staying in a small rental house with 4 other guys who were doing the same work. Day after day, we went out together and came back together. Most of the time we worked in groups because one of the company policies was to avoid being alone in the forest whenever possible, which honestly made sense. Something as simple as twisting an ankle out there could quickly become a serious situation. The problem was that we did not always follow those rules very carefully. Most of us were young, impatient, and more interested in finishing the work quickly so we could relax afterward. People would naturally drift apart during the day, especially once everybody became comfortable with the area. Another thing that eventually contributed to everything that happened was that after a while, I genuinely started disliking the other guys I worked with. I felt like they had absolutely no respect for the forest. To them, it was just another temporary job. If they saw trash on the ground, they ignored it. Sometimes they added to it themselves. One of them nearly hurt an animal once, and I still honestly do not know what he planned to do because I stopped him before anything happened. It was that kind of behavior, the kind that immediately tells you somebody does not belong in a place like that. They did not respect the mountains, and because of that, I slowly started distancing myself from them. I was never the kind of person who stayed quiet when I saw things I considered wrong, so there were arguments, tension, stupid fights over little things. Eventually, I mostly kept to myself. I would do my work, come back to the house, sleep, and avoid them whenever possible. The job lasted 4 months straight, and I would say things started changing around the 2-month mark, once I had become comfortable enough in the forest to stop treating it cautiously. Around that time, I also became more interested in the local stories connected to the mountains. Not because I believed them, but because I found them entertaining. There are countless legends tied to the Appalachians, especially once you spend enough time around people who actually grew up there. Most of the older locals spoke about the forest in a way that almost made it sound alive. Again, I never took any of it seriously. Part of my work involved occasionally checking on an old fire lookout tower deep in one section of the mountains. The structure still technically belonged to the state, even though it had been abandoned for decades. So, every once in a while, somebody had to make sure it was still standing and had not become dangerous. There were times when hikers or hunters used it for shelter, which was completely normal, and whenever somebody was already staying there, I would simply leave them alone and come back another day. Most of the time, though, the tower was empty. Tourism still was not particularly heavy in that area during the early 90s, and the lookout itself looked old enough that many people probably avoided sleeping there altogether. The structure creaked constantly when the wind hit it, and from a distance, it honestly looked like the kind of place that could collapse if you leaned on the wrong wall. It was during one of those nights at the lookout, probably the 3rd time I had decided to stay there overnight, that things began happening. Originally, I had not even planned to spend the night there. My intention was to finish my inspection and head back before dark. But toward the end of the afternoon, an enormous wall of fog started rolling through the forest around the tower. I mean the kind of fog that completely swallows the mountains. You could stand near the edge of the platform and barely see beyond the trees directly below you. Even back then, before I took any of the local stories seriously, I knew enough to understand that a lot of Appalachian legends are tied to fog. I remember feeling uneasy in a way I could not really explain, so instead of risking the trails after dark, I decided to stay inside the lookout until morning. I locked the door, settled in, and tried to relax. Normally when I planned to spend the night there, I brought something to keep myself occupied, usually a book or magazines. But that night, I had absolutely nothing with me. So for the first time since finding the tower, I started properly exploring every corner of the place just to kill time. I checked drawers, storage compartments, shelves, anything I had ignored during previous visits. Eventually, I noticed that one section of wall beside the old desk looked slightly loose, almost as if somebody had pried it open before. When I pushed against it, I realized there was a narrow hidden space between the inner and outer walls of the tower. Inside that space was a small portable cassette recorder along with several old tapes. From what I could piece together afterward, the recordings had belonged to one of the last fire watchers stationed there sometime in the late 50s. Another watcher disappeared a few years later during the 60s. And not long after that, the station was permanently abandoned. Most of the tapes were damaged. Some sections cut out entirely, while others were buried under static. But little by little, I started understanding fragments of what the man had been documenting. Many of the recordings mentioned fog. Not normal fog exactly, but heavy waves of it moving through the forest in ways that deeply unsettled him. He kept talking about men walking through the woods during those nights, men who only seemed to appear when the fog became thick enough to hide the mountains entirely. At first, I misunderstood what he meant. Honestly, my first assumption was that he was talking about hunters. Strange hunters, maybe, but still just hunters. I figured there were probably groups who preferred tracking animals in those conditions because it made things more difficult or more exciting. Weird, sure, but people form hobbies around all kinds of things. That was my thinking in the beginning. But the more recordings I managed to piece together, the more uncomfortable I started feeling. I started noticing a pattern in some of the recordings. The man speaking was clearly under an unbelievable amount of stress. Several times he sounded like he was begging something for help, although because of the damage on the tapes, I could never fully understand who he was talking to or what exactly was happening around him. But one thing became increasingly clear the more I listened. He was not describing a group of hunters moving through the fog. He kept referring to one specific person, one man. Or at least, he believed it was a man. There was one recording in particular that stuck with me more than any of the others. His voice sounded exhausted, shaky, like somebody who had not slept properly in days. And I remember hearing him say that he was absolutely certain the man in the fog was not hunting animals. He was hunting people. Even then, I still could not fully process what I was listening to. Part of me wondered if the tapes were some kind of joke left behind by previous workers. Another part of me thought maybe the man had simply lost his mind from isolation after spending too long alone in those mountains. But regardless of what explanation I tried giving myself, I eventually had to stop listening for a while because I could physically feel my anxiety getting worse. The fear in his voice was starting to affect me. It felt less like I was listening to somebody tell a story and more like I was slowly being pulled directly into whatever he had experienced out there. As most people know, fire lookouts are built with windows on almost every side, so you can see for miles across the mountains. And sitting there in the darkness, I could clearly watch the fog growing thicker around the forest below me. At some point, I noticed something that immediately made my stomach drop. There was a light moving through the fog. At first, I assumed it was just a flashlight belonging to another hiker, or maybe somebody moving through the woods at night. But it was already completely dark outside by then, and the fog had only become heavier. That was when I suddenly remembered one specific thing the man on the recordings had said. He mentioned that if he ever saw somebody outside during the fog, he immediately shut off every light inside the tower, so nobody would know he was there. Thankfully, I had already done exactly that. The moment I heard him say it earlier in the recordings, something about the way he spoke had unsettled me enough that I instinctively turned off all the lights in the lookout. So by that point, the tower looked completely abandoned from outside. I stayed as low and quiet as possible while watching the light move slowly through the trees below me. Then I heard two things that genuinely terrified me more than anything I had experienced up until that moment. First, I heard a gunshot. And almost immediately after that, I heard somebody scream. Not an animal, but a person. At nearly the exact same moment, the light I had been watching suddenly started moving quickly through the fog, rushing toward wherever the scream had come from. That was the moment I stopped caring whether the recordings were real or not. Someone was hunting in those woods, and whoever had screamed had not been attacked by an animal. I did not stop to think any further after that. I grabbed the few things I had brought with me, threw open the door of the lookout, and started running through the forest in the opposite direction from the gunshot and the light. I did not use a flashlight. I tried making as little noise as possible while still moving as fast as I could through the trees. I remember falling multiple times. I scraped my arms and legs badly against branches and rocks. At one point, I even hit my head hard enough that I probably should have stopped to recover, but the adrenaline completely took over, and I just kept running. I honestly do not even know how long I kept moving through those woods before daylight finally started appearing. By the next morning, I had reached an area I did not recognize at all. I was completely lost, exhausted, dehydrated, and honestly close to panicking again. But luckily, I came across a couple camping nearby. They were experienced hikers, and the moment they saw the state I was in, they immediately helped me without hesitation, which honestly says a lot, because people who spend enough time in isolated forests sometimes avoid getting involved in situations like that out of fear for their own safety. They gave me water, helped me calm down, and eventually walked me back toward a neighboring access road where they had parked their truck. From there, they drove me all the way back to the town where I had been staying. Once I got back, I reported everything to the local sheriff. I told him I had heard a gunshot deep in the forest, followed by somebody screaming. He said they would look into it, although, as far as I know, nothing ever came from it. At least, nothing I was ever told about. Afterward, I started hearing stories from some of the locals, especially older people who had lived in the area most of their lives. I never returned to that section of the forest again, and from that moment forward, I also stopped wandering away from the other workers whenever we were out on trails. What I eventually learned was that the area around that fire lookout had a long history of disappearances attached to it. There were very few official records left behind, because this had happened during a period when documentation in isolated areas was inconsistent at best. Most of what still exists today survives only through local stories passed down by people who remember hearing about it from older relatives. There is almost nothing formal you can actually look up or verify. Eventually, the job ended, and I never once considered applying for anything like it again. I warned as many people as I could to stay away from that section of the mountains. I usually told them there were reckless hunters in the area and that somebody could easily get shot by mistake. I never told anybody the full truth because I knew exactly how insane it would sound. And honestly, even today, I still do not fully understand what was happening out there. I do not know if it was something supernatural. I do not know if it was simply a man who had been living in those forests for decades and used the fog to hunt people without ever being seen properly. I have no explanation. What still disturbs me is the fact that the man who made those recordings had been there over 30 years before I arrived, which means whatever he encountered may have still been there all that time later. I have replayed this story in my head countless times over the years, trying to make sense of it, and I still cannot. I never returned to the Appalachians after that job ended, and even now, decades later, hearing the name of those mountains still gives me chills. It was probably the most exciting period of my life. That part is true. But it was also the most terrifying.